The morning rush at the Argent was a ballet of precision and pretense. Luggage glided across the polished floors like swans. Suits were tailored coffees extra hot, and egos perpetually fragile. In a city that never stopped selling dreams, the Argent catered to those who could afford to buy reality instead. Behind the counter, three receptionists tapped on keyboards, whispering frantically. A fourth staff member, young red-cheeked fresh out of hospitality school, was visibly sweating. His eyes darted toward the woman standing inches from the desk. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't thrown a tantrum. And yet her silence spoke volumes. Clad in black from head to toe, her hijab wrapped in silk folds that hinted at royalty, the woman's presence commanded attention without demanding it. Her suitcase matte black, no tags, no stickers, stood upright like a sentinel. "Did anyone try Turkish?" one receptionist whispered. "She's not Turkish. I think she's Gulf," another replied. A tall woman in a tight gray blazer strode in stilettos, clicking like a metronome of impatience. Her name badge read, Victoria Wells, Lobby Operations Manager. She didn't glance at the woman, not directly. Instead, she addressed the staff loud enough for guests to hear. "What's the issue?" "She doesn't speak English, ma'am," the young receptionist stammered. Victoria arched an eyebrow. "And yet she managed to book the presidential suite." A translator was already being ushered in, then another, then a third. One tried Arabic. The woman didn't flinch. Another tried Farsi. Nothing. Thai. Still nothing. They shook their heads, defeated like doctors, unable to diagnose a perfectly calm patient. In the corner, a bellboy fidgeted nervously. A group of international business travelers had stopped chatting and begun recording discreetly on their phones. The air was sharp with embarrassment. Across the lobby, scrubbing quietly near the entrance, was a man in a janitor's uniform. He moved with slow precision, the kind that came from years of being invisible. Malcolm Reed. His mop glided across the floor like a paintbrush. His eyes, however, were fixed not on the floor but on the woman. Something about her stance, her stillness, the way her fingers pressed together beneath her sleeves. He had seen that gesture before. Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "This is America," she snapped, stepping forward. "If she can't speak English, then maybe she shouldn't be staying at a five-star American hotel." The room went still. Someone coughed. Another shifted uncomfortably in their leather loafers. The woman blinked once slowly. Her chin remained lifted. Malcolm paused, the mop water dripping into silence. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, not yet. "I'm canceling the reservation," Victoria declared. "Call security." Layla's assistant, a young man with trembling hands, rapidly typed on his phone in Arabic. His eyes darted nervously toward the woman. Guests whispered. Phones were raised a little higher now. One camera lens zoomed in, and that's when Malcolm stopped wiping. He stood up slowly, hands still gloved, the wet cloth still dangling at his side. He looked once at the polished floor, then up at the woman. Their eyes met across the chaos. She didn't smile, but her gaze softened. Just enough for Malcolm to feel something stir in his chest, something long buried. He exhaled, quietly removed one glove, and took a step forward. The mop dropped against the marble with a soft, echoing thud. And just like that, the room forgot about the woman in the black abaya. Because now everyone was staring at the janitor. There are men who live their entire lives in silence, not because they have nothing to say, but because the world never bothered to listen. Malcolm Reed had been one of them for years. But today in this glittering lobby, filled with entitlement and polished shoes, something shifted, and he felt it deep in his bones. He didn't move right away. He just stood there, one hand still gloved the other, bare, the scent of disinfectant clinging faintly to his uniform. Across the lobby, the woman in black had barely moved either, but her stillness no longer felt distant. It felt deliberate, familiar, intimate even. And Malcolm realized he had seen that kind of poise before, not in this city, but in another life. Years ago, long before he ever touched a mop, Malcolm had stood in front of crowded lecture halls in Khartoum, Sudan, writing Arabic poetry on dusty chalkboards and lecturing in 5 languages. He was Professor Reed back then, linguist, scholar, husband, father. Then the war came. He'd lost his wife in a bombing that collapsed half their apartment building. She had gone out to buy mangoes and never returned. 3 days later, Malcolm took his daughter and everything he could carry and crossed 2 borders without ever turning back. America had been a promise whispered in refugee shelters, the land of second chances of dignity. But that promise had come with conditions, ones Malcolm hadn't expected. In his first year in the U.S., he applied for teaching jobs, over 30 of them, but was told again and again that he lacked American cultural fluency. One dean had even said it flat out: "Your accent makes the board nervous." So Malcolm did what many proud, brilliant men are forced to do when the world narrows its lens. He swallowed his pride and took the job that kept the lights on and the rent paid. Overnight, he became the man who entered rooms only after others had left, the one who cleaned up after executive meetings he once used to lead. He never corrected anyone who called him sir without looking up, never challenged a guest who snapped fingers at him like he was a vending machine. He told himself it was temporary, that one day somehow the world would remember who he really was. But it had been 6 years, and every time he looked in the mirror, he wasn't sure the man staring back still believed in someday. Every night in his small studio apartment 3 blocks from the Argent, after his daughter fell asleep, Malcolm would sit under a flickering kitchen light and read Arabic newspapers out loud just to keep his tongue sharp. He would whisper verses from Al-Mutanabi, recite old poems he used to teach. He kept a small, tattered book of Najdi dialect proverbs tucked between cleaning manuals in his locker. No one knew. No one cared. That was how he liked it, or so he told himself. But now, watching this woman, Layla, stand alone in a sea of arrogance, enduring humiliation without flinching, something cracked inside him. The way she adjusted her hijab with quiet precision, the subtle placement of her thumb near her temple. That gesture wasn't just cultural, it was regional. Najd. Central Saudi. He knew it like he knew the lines of his own palms. He thought about the look in her eyes, that kind of poised fury that only came from being underestimated for far too long. It was the same look his wife had once worn when a foreign general called her girl in a checkpoint line. That was the last time Malcolm had raised his voice in public, and the last time he'd felt like himself. Now, as Victoria paced in stilettos behind the reception desk, barking into her walkie-talkie and calling for security, Malcolm stood in the center of the lobby like a fracture forming in a marble floor. The room hadn't noticed him yet, not really. They still thought he was just the janitor. But the old words were coming back to him. The tone, the cadence. He took one slow breath, like drawing strength from somewhere beyond this place, from Sudan, from exile, from his wife's absence, from the daughter he tucked in every night without fail. Then he set the mop aside, not flung, not dropped, just placed with quiet finality on the rim of the bucket, like a man folding his past and laying it down. He stood up, fully adjusted his collar, and stepped away from the yellow caution sign that had always been the only thing protecting him from notice. And as he began walking one measured step after another, the sound of Victoria's shouting blurred behind him. Because across the lobby, Layla had turned slightly, and for the first time she was looking straight at him. The soft thud of Malcolm's boots echoed faintly as he crossed the marble floor. The polished surface still glistening behind him, a trail of silent labor left like a watermark on privilege. He moved slowly with the cautious reverence of someone stepping onto a stage he had never been allowed to stand on. The kind of stage that had always belonged to others. Louder men, richer men, men who hadn't spent the last 6 years learning how to disappear. And yet now all eyes followed him. He didn't look at Victoria. He didn't glance at the bellboys who froze mid-step, nor at the guests craning their necks, phones raised, slightly unsure if this was a performance or a reckoning. His gaze never left Layla, not even for a heartbeat. He stopped just 2 steps away from her, close enough for her to see that the lines on his face weren't from age alone, but from a lifetime of restraint. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate, not booming, not dramatic, but true. "Salam alaikum wa rahmatullah," he said gently in flawless Najdi Arabic. The cadence was soft-rounded at the edges, marked by the subtle, honorific lilt that was reserved for speaking to someone of noble lineage. "Ya bent al-Fahim, hal yumkinuni musa'adatuki." The air cracked like glass. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they wrapped around the room, perfectly placed, perfectly pronounced. A linguistic precision no translator that day had come close to. The silence that followed was not from confusion, but from collective disbelief. Layla turned to him slowly, her eyes sharp as obsidian a moment before, softened not in submission, but in recognition. For the first time, the walls she had built around herself in this cold, indifferent city seemed to waver. Wa alaikum salam, she replied, her voice steady, deep with cultured calm. Tusharafna ya ustad. And in that moment, something wordless passed between them. Not deference, not debt, but equality. Two people who had worn masks for survival, finally seeing each other without them. Behind them, one of the translators lowered his gaze and stepped back. Another adjusted his tie uncomfortably. The third simply walked away silent. The hierarchy had just shifted, and they felt it like a quake underfoot. The tension broke with the shriek of stilettos scraping marble. Victoria stormed forward, her face flushed with fury and disbelief. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she spat, her voice laced with venom. "You are a janitor. You don't talk to guests. That's not your role. Get back to your damn station right now." Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he turned slightly to Layla and with the same calm, respectful tone asked in Arabic, "Are you here to confirm the investment terms in person, madam, or would you prefer to discuss the contract details elsewhere?" Layla didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her handbag's sleek, structured designer and pulled out a phone. With one swift motion, she tapped the screen and held it up. Victoria's voice blasted from the speaker, unmistakable and unedited. "If she can't speak English, then maybe she shouldn't be staying at a five-star American hotel." Gasps scattered across the lobby like broken glass. The clip wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. It wasn't just the content, it was the tone, the contempt, the arrogance, the assumption of superiority spoken not to correct but to condemn. And now it was echoing through the same lobby it had tried to dominate. Layla lowered the phone, placed it calmly back in her bag, and then looked slowly around the room, eyes landing on faces that were either embarrassed, shocked, or pretending to be very interested in the floor tiles. Then for the first time that morning, she spoke in English. "I would like to speak," she said with regal clarity, each word falling like polished stone, "to whoever is in charge of this hotel's financial decisions." Her accent was precise, her tone ice cold. Victoria opened her mouth, perhaps to object, perhaps to lie, but no sound came out. Her authority, once towering, now teetered like a chandelier with frayed wiring. And Malcolm, he remained where he was, still, steady, unbothered. Because for the first time in years, he hadn't just stepped forward, he had been seen. For a brief moment, the entire lobby stood frozen, not in silence this time, but in stunned suspension, as if the walls themselves had heard something they couldn't quite believe. Layla's words hung in the air, unapologetically clear. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. Power doesn't beg to be heard, it simply is. "I am a strategic shareholder from Abu Dhabi," she repeated, her voice steady, almost serene, like the calm before a monsoon. "And I'm currently reviewing a $40 million expansion deal with the Argent Hotel Group." This she motioned lightly around the room was a field test. The room didn't gasp this time. It shrank. You could feel the atmosphere contract like a lung knocked breathless. Several guests turned suddenly unsure whether they had been watching entertainment or history. Phones that had been held up casually now lowered reverently. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Her eyes darted toward the front desk, then toward the staff huddled nearby, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. She adjusted her blazer with trembling fingers, trying to summon the voice of someone still in control. This is clearly a misunderstanding." She managed her tone now, forced and syrupy. "Miss Al-Fahim, you didn't identify yourself. Had we known you were, you would have treated me like royalty." Layla interrupted her words, neither cruel nor kind, but utterly indifferent. "That's precisely the problem." Victoria flinched. Malcolm, who had remained still beside her, finally spoke again, not to provoke but to correct. "She didn't need to introduce herself," he said calmly, turning to face the room. "How you treat someone who can't prove their importance. That's the real test." No one answered. No one dared. Layla reached for her phone again this time, dialing no theatrics, no drama, just quiet, decisive movement. She stepped aside slightly and spoke in Arabic to someone on the other end, her voice low and controlled. The only English phrase that broke through was immediate personnel review. The whisper moved faster than sound. Within minutes, a man in a navy blue suit emerged from the executive hallway. His expression was taut, his movements clipped. Senior staff began to assemble wordlessly, their eyes scanning the room for context. Some recognized Layla immediately. Others understood quickly enough. Victoria tried again. "I've been here 9 years," she said, her voice barely concealing her panic. "I've led this lobby through award seasons, international summits, VIP clients from 4 continents. I've never had a single complaint. And yet the man in the Navy suit interrupted today will be your first." She turned sharply toward him. "Jonathan, please." But he raised a hand. "You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. This is not disciplinary. It's procedural. But I expect your badge and clearance submitted by the end of the day." Victoria went pale. Someone at the front desk quietly pressed the Do Not Disturb toggle on her personnel file. The lobby murmured. Malcolm instinctively took a small step back as if remembering his place. His hands drifted toward the gloves in his pocket. The mop bucket sat forgotten near the entrance, and for a fleeting second the desire to vanish returned. He had done what needed to be done. He had spoken up, cracked the glass, but this wasn't his world. Not really. Not yet. He turned slightly, ready to withdraw before anyone noticed him still standing there. But Layla noticed. She turned back toward him, not slowly, not dramatically, but with absolute clarity. Her eyes found his, and this time her voice softened, not in weakness, but in invitation. "Fritaram, read," she said now in English. "Do you want to keep shrinking into a role someone else wrote for you? Or do you want to claim the place you've always deserved?" The question hit harder than any accusation ever could. Malcolm didn't answer right away. His fingers flexed at his sides, not from fear, but from the strange ache of hope. A hope he'd buried beneath practicality, beneath rent checks and graveyard shifts, beneath the quiet belief that his time had passed. And yet here it was, a door, open. Not handed to him, not gifted, but earned in full view of a world that had once looked through him like glass. He lowered his gaze for a moment, not in submission, but in reverence for the weight of the moment. Then he lifted it again and nodded. A silent yes. Not because he thought he was ready, but because for the first time in years, someone finally believed he was. "You have no idea what you just lost," Victoria, Layla said, not loudly, not cruelly, just with the kind of poised finality that silences even the most persistent arrogance. Then she turned slightly, her gaze shifting to Malcolm, who had instinctively stepped back again, as if retreating into the comfort of invisibility. "And you," she said, voice warm, now almost amused, "you're exactly what we've been looking for." It was too much for Victoria. One moment she had been the gatekeeper of the grandest hotel in the city, the queen of reception, the face of elite hospitality. The next she was standing in the middle of her own kingdom, stripped of power, authority, and worse, relevance. Her jaw clenched. She turned sharply toward Malcolm, eyes sharp, lips curled into a bitter smile. "Let's not pretend," she sneered. "You're just a janitor, a mop, and a few fancy foreign words don't make you somebody. Don't get ahead of yourself." Malcolm didn't flinch. He merely looked at her calmly, evenly, and replied not in English, but in elegant French, the kind of Parisian dialect taught in universities, not tourism apps. "Il est facile de juger quand on ignore l'histoire de quelqu'un." It's easy to judge when you don't know someone's story. Victoria blinked, stunned, caught off guard by the elegance of it, as if she'd just been outmaneuvered in a language she didn't even understand. Before she could respond, Layla let out a quiet laugh, one of genuine admiration. "Not just Arabic," she said, addressing the room now. "He speaks 5 languages, and he used to be a professor of linguistics before coming here." That statement, soft as it was, sent a ripple through the crowd. The front desk staff exchanged stunned glances. A guest near the elevator whispered something to his companion. A woman near the bar discreetly angled her phone, clearly live streaming. Even the concierge, who had watched everything unfold from a respectful distance, looked down ashamed. Malcolm spoke again, his voice steady, not boastful. "I taught in North Africa for almost a decade," he said, finally lifting his eyes to the room. "When the conflict broke out, I lost my wife in an airstrike. My daughter and I fled with nothing but 2 backpacks and a promise I made her that she'd grow up safe, even if I had to scrub floors to make it happen." You could hear a pin drop. "I took this job," he continued, "because it was the only one that would have me. Not because I stopped being who I was, but because I needed to survive. In that moment, Malcolm wasn't just a man in uniform. He was a mirror reflecting back the quiet sacrifices of so many people the world overlooks every single day. His story wasn't rare, but the fact that it was being heard, that was revolutionary. Then the air changed again, this time colder. A tall man in a navy blue suit emerged from the corridor behind the check-in desk, moving with the restrained intensity of someone accustomed to crisis. His face was unreadable, but his eyes swept the room with practiced precision. It was Jonathan Bennett, the regional director of the Argent hotel chain, and from the way the junior staff straightened at the sight of him, it was clear he didn't show up for just anything. "I've listened to the entire incident," he said, cutting through the silence. "Every word from the initial misunderstanding to the recordings shared with our board." "I'm appalled," Victoria tried to interject, raising a hand half-heartedly. "Sir, I, Miss Wells," he said coolly, "you are relieved of all duties effective immediately. Your clearance is suspended and you are not to return to this location until our internal investigation concludes." Her face drained of color. She stood motionless, suddenly weightless, as if the floor itself no longer held her. She looked around searching for support but found only the backs of colleagues who had already turned away. Malcolm, watching the collapse of someone who had towered over him for years, instinctively stepped back again, not out of fear, but out of reflex, as if he'd overstepped something unspoken. And yet before he could fade again, Layla stepped forward. She reached out gently and placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet gesture, but one that anchored him firmly in the moment. "I have a proposition," she said softly. And this time, Malcolm didn't move. Opportunities, when they come, aren't always wrapped in ribbon. Sometimes they arrive quietly disguised as moments of tension, born out of injustice, and meant not to reward, but to restore what should never have been taken. Layla's hand remained steady on Malcolm's shoulder, her presence neither commanding nor soft but resolute, like someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "Mr. Reed," she said, turning slightly so her voice carried just enough to reach the staff and executives still lingering around the perimeter, "I would like to formally offer you the position of Global Director of Cultural Integration for our International Hotel Expansion Division." There were no gas this time, no theatrics, just the quiet unraveling of expectations. "You'll be responsible for training staff across 5 continents," she continued, "ensuring our clients, regardless of language, accent, or attire, are treated not only with courtesy, but with dignity. Starting salary $100,000 a year, full relocation support, and most importantly, authority." Malcolm didn't react right away. He blinked, took a small instinctive step back. The words didn't register fully. Or maybe they did, and that was the problem. His eyes searched her face for the kind of smirk that comes with a joke, but there was none. Just sincerity, unshaken and unwavering. I clean floors," he said at last, his voice nearly a whisper. "I don't think I'm exactly," Layla interrupted, a gentle smile playing at the edge of her lips. "You didn't raise your hand. You didn't demand attention. You just acted when it mattered. That's leadership. That's what I want representing this brand." Malcolm opened his mouth again, but no words came. He looked down at his gloves, fingers still curled around them, the latex slightly wrinkled from hours of use. His uniform felt tighter now, like a skin he was being asked to shed. Across the lobby, phones continued recording, but not with the same voyeuristic curiosity as before. Now the energy had shifted. It wasn't spectacle anymore. It was witnessing. Within hours, video clips would begin circulating across social media: the janitor who spoke Arabic, the manager who screamed the billionaire heiress who rewrote the rules in real time. Hashtags would trend, think pieces would be written, memes would flood timelines. But none of that mattered to Malcolm in this moment. What mattered was this: someone had finally seen him, not the title on his badge, not the mop in his hand, but the man behind all of it. Jonathan Bennett stepped forward, then his voice lower, but no less firm. "I spent the last 3 years pushing HR to expand our diversity recruiting," he admitted. "Thought we needed to scout fresh talent, tap new markets. Turns out the talent was already here, right under our roof. We just never looked down far enough." Malcolm didn't respond right away. He looked at Layla, then at the room, and finally at his own hands. Slowly, he pulled off the gloves one finger at a time, not in haste, not for drama, but with care, as if folding up the last 6 years of silence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply nodded once, then walked toward Layla, no longer as a janitor, but as a man reclaiming his place in the world. The applause didn't erupt. It built slowly, then steadily, until the lobby filled with something far louder than clapping. It filled with recognition. For Malcolm. For dignity. For the simple, undeniable truth that merit doesn't wear a uniform. 6 months later, the sun burned low above Dubai's skyline, gold reflecting off of glass towers and marble fountains. Inside the atrium of a new luxury hotel, the first in Argent's Middle East expansion, Malcolm Reed adjusted the collar of his tailored navy suit, the name badge on his chest no longer generic but engraved. Beside him stood his daughter, dressed in a soft white dress, eyes wide with awe, as she took in the chandeliers, the sweeping staircase, the sea of international guests. She tugged gently at his sleeve and looked up. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the opening ceremony. "I'm proud of you for not staying quiet." Malcolm looked down at her, eyes shimmering, not from pride alone, but from the realization that his silence had never truly protected her. Only his voice ever could. He squeezed her hand and smiled. True strength was never about titles, Malcolm thought, as he stood behind the curved glass podium, his hands resting gently on either side. It wasn't about the plaque on his office door or the applause that now met his every entrance. Real power, the kind that actually changes the course of a life, lives in the moment someone chooses to stand when the world begs them to shrink. The new Argent Hotel in Dubai shimmered behind him like a jewel carved from the horizon. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a skyline where past and future converged, minarets and modern towers in the same frame. Cameras clicked softly. Journalists scribbled. But Malcolm wasn't reading a script. He didn't need one. He glanced to his left, and there she was, his daughter Elena, standing with quiet poise just off stage. She wore a simple white dress, the kind little girls pick when they feel beautiful. Her hair was pulled back with care, and her eyes, wide, watchful, luminous, never left him. In her gaze was the kind of pride that couldn't be taught. It had to be earned, and it had been moment by moment over years of quiet sacrifice that no one had seen. Until now. "I used to mop floors in silence," Malcolm began, his voice calm but resonant. "Not because I lacked words, but because I believed no one would listen. But what I've learned painfully, beautifully, is that sometimes it takes just one moment of courage to remind the world who you really are." There was no microphone feedback, no dramatic swelling music, just stillness. And into that stillness walked Layla Al Fahim. She moved with that same effortless grace she had on the morning they met, elegant without ostentation, calm without apology. She stepped beside Malcolm, rested a hand gently on his shoulder, and looked at him. Not as a boss looks at an employee, but as one survivor of silence looks at another who finally broke it. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their eyes met, and in that quiet exchange lived an entire unspoken history of misjudged origins, invisible brilliance, and the long winding road back to self-worth. In a flash, Malcolm's mind flickered back, not in full memory, but in sensory echoes. Cold tiles beneath his feet, the sharp smell of bleach, the hum of disrespect disguised as order. He saw Victoria's face again, twisted with contempt. He remembered the feel of the mop handle beneath his palm as he laid it down, not knowing that letting go of it would be the moment everything changed. And then, the silence that had followed. That sacred, unexpected silence when he had first spoken Arabic aloud, and the room for once had listened. His eyes misted, but he didn't falter. "There are people in this world," he continued, "who spend their whole lives being looked through, dismissed, forgotten. They become shadows not because they are weak, but because the world forgets to ask who they are." He paused, looking out across the sea of executives, dignitaries, and staff, and finally he spotted her. At the far end of the marble lobby, a young front desk trainee was being scolded by a guest, not rudely but firmly. Her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with the guest receipt, her posture shrinking with every second. Malcolm quietly stepped down from the podium. He crossed the floor, each stride confident but unhurried, his suit jacket brushing slightly with every step. He reached the girl just as the guest turned away, muttering. She looked up, startled, and Malcolm smiled, not as a superior, but as someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be in her shoes. "We must never forget," he said gently, his voice just for her, what it felt like to be ignored. "So when the time comes, we make sure no one else has to feel that." The girl blinked, and something in her eyes shifted just a fraction, but enough. Malcolm turned back toward the lobby, toward Elena, toward the glass walls that framed a city where the future was still being written. His voice now, part narration, part memory, lingered in the air, like the final line of a great story. "Justice doesn't always come from anger. It comes from clarity, and the courage to speak when silence seems safer." And then he walked forward, not toward power, not toward applause, but toward peace, toward the man he had always been. And finally, the world followed. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity can rise from silence, and that no act of quiet courage is ever wasted, we invite you to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching. And remember, your worth isn't defined by your title, but by the truth you dare to live out loud.